The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber as Flight 2847 leveled out above the clouds, and for a moment, business class felt almost peaceful. Then her voice cut through the hush like broken glass. "Stay in, coach, you're just trash." Victoria Ashford's manicured hand swept across the tray table and a small toy F-22. Its paint worn thin from a child's love clattered to the floor. 7-year-old Ethan Carter froze. His father Daniel in grease-stained coveralls did not raise his voice. He did not raise his eyes in anger. He simply knelt, lifted the broken toy, and pulled his son close. But what no one on that flight could have guessed was that only a few hours later, the very man she had called trash would bring an entire Air Force hangar to attention. The boarding line at O'Hare moved with the patient shuffle of travelers who had grown used to delays. Daniel Carter held his son's hand and tried not to think about where they were going. Ethan was 7, and he carried the toy F-22 the way other boys his age carried teddy bears close to the chest. Both small hands wrapped around it, as though letting go would mean losing something he could never get back. The paint along the swept wings had worn down to bare gray plastic in places. The cockpit canopy was scratched. Daniel had offered more than once to buy him a new one. Ethan had always shaken his head. This was the one his mother had pressed into his palm in the hospital, 2 days before she stopped opening her eyes. That had been 3 years ago now. 3 years of Daniel learning how to braid hair badly for school pictures, how to pack a lunchbox that didn't embarrass a first grader, how to be both parents at once on a mechanic's wages. His coveralls still carried the faint smell of motor oil, no matter how many times he washed them. His hands, scrubbed twice before they left the apartment, still had grease lodged dark beneath the nails. He hadn't owned a suit in years and hadn't seen the need to buy one for a flight. The gate agent scanned his boarding pass, and her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Sir, you've been upgraded. Business class. Seats 4A and 4B. Daniel blinked. "Are you sure? Frequent flyer miles," she said, smiling down at Ethan. "Looks like you've been saving them up for a while." He had. For 5 years. He had been saving them for a vacation he kept promising his wife they would take someday. Now they were carrying him and his son to a funeral in Norfolk, Virginia, where his mother would be lowered into the ground beside a husband she had outlived by less than a year. Daniel thanked the agent quietly, and they walked down the jet bridge together. Ethan's eyes went wide as they stepped into the cabin. The seats were deep and leather soft. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber that made everything feel like it belonged to a world Daniel did not. He guided his son to the window seat and watched the boy press his nose to the glass the F-22 cradled in his lap. "Dad," Ethan whispered. "It's like a movie." Daniel almost smiled. He buckled them both in and tried to settle into the seat, but his body never quite forgot how to sit a certain way when an aircraft moved beneath him. His back stayed straight. His eyes drifted by habit to the wing. As the engine spooled and Flight 2847 began to taxi, Daniel watched the leading-edge slats deploy. He watched them retract. He noted the flap setting the rotation speed, the subtle shudder, as the landing gear retracted into its bay. None of it was something he meant to do. It was simply how his eyes worked when there was an airplane underneath him. Ethan glanced sideways. "Dad, you're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Looking at the wing." Daniel let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Old habit, buddy." Across the aisle, an elderly man in a gray cardigan looked up from a worn paperback. His eyes lingered on Daniel for a second longer than they should have, taking in the coveralls, the scarred knuckles, the way the man in seat 4A scanned the wing with the calm of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. Then the old man returned to his book, but a faint smile had settled into the corners of his mouth. She boarded last. Victoria Ashford did not walk down the aisle so much as she announced herself through it. Her heels were the kind that cost more than Daniel made in a month. Her coat was wool, the color of poured cream, draped just so over one arm. A Cartier watch glinted at her wrist, and the scent of something French and expensive arrived ahead of her. She took her seat 3A directly in front of Daniel and immediately pulled out her phone. Her thumb moved across the screen in short, irritated swipes. Once, twice, 3 times, she opened the same message. Read it closed. It opened it again. The hand holding the phone trembled just slightly before she set it face down on the armrest and reached for the champagne flute a flight attendant had brought without being asked. She did not drink it right away. She held the stem between 2 fingers and looked out the window like she was trying to keep something inside herself from spilling. The man in the gray cardigan glanced at her, then at Daniel, then back to his book. What Victoria saw when she finally turned her head was a man in coveralls holding the small hand of a child, clutching a battered toy. What she did not know, what she could not know, was that everything she had spent the morning trying not to feel was about to find a target. Her younger brother had died in a training accident 2 years ago next month. The Air Force inquiry had quietly closed the file. Her family's lawyers had not. She was flying to Norfolk to sit across a table from a base commander and demand the name of the senior pilot her family believed had signed off on the flight that killed him. And here, 2 feet behind her, sat a man with engine grease under his fingernails and the easy posture of someone who had never been afraid of a sky. She did not understand then why looking at him made her want to break something. She turned fully in her seat. "Excuse me." A flight attendant materialized at her elbow. "Yes, ma'am. I'd like to verify that this gentleman is in the correct cabin." Her voice carried calm and clear, designed to be heard. "Business class." The attendant's expression did not change, but a thin line appeared between her brows. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass, please?" Daniel handed it over without a word. The attendant glanced at it, returned it, and addressed Victoria with practiced patience. "Mr. Carter is in the correct seat, ma'am. He has been upgraded." "Upgraded." Victoria repeated the word, as if testing how it tasted. "How interesting." She turned forward again, and for a moment Daniel thought it was over. It was not. She lifted her phone, tapped the screen, and spoke just loudly enough for the rows around her to hear. "Some people," she said to no one and to everyone, "should understand that there are spaces in this world they don't belong in. You can buy a ticket. You can't buy class." A businessman 2 rows up shifted uncomfortably. The elderly man in the cardigan turned a page very slowly, his eyes no longer on the book. Ethan looked up at his father. Daniel shook his head just barely. "Not worth it." The boy nodded and turned back to the window, holding the F-22 a little tighter. But Victoria was not finished. She glanced back over her shoulder at the toy in Ethan's hands and let out a short, dismissive breath. "And the cheap plastic toys. Of course." Ethan's small shoulders stiffened. He set the F-22 carefully on the tray table between him and his father, as if to prove it was not cheap, as if to dare her to say it again. The little plane sat there in its faded gray, one wingtip, nicked the canopy clouded with the fingerprints of 3 years of being held. That was when Victoria reached across the aisle. The gesture was too smooth to be anything but deliberate, and her hand swept past the tray. "Stay in, coach, you're just trash." The toy clattered to the floor. One of its wings snapped cleanly off and skidded under the seat in front of them. Ethan made a sound that was not quite a word. His face crumpled. Tears welled up before he could stop them, and the toy his mother had given him lay in 2 pieces on the carpet of a plane. He had thought only moments ago was something out of a movie. The cabin held its breath. Everyone waited for the father to stand up. Everyone waited for the shouting. Daniel did neither. He bent forward, slowly lifted the small fuselage from the floor, reached under the seat for the broken wing, and set them both gently in his lap. From the inside pocket of his coveralls, he drew out a handkerchief, clean folded, the kind of thing a man carries when he has learned to anticipate his child's tears and wiped a smudge from the plane's nose. Then he placed it in Ethan's hands, closed the boy's small fingers around it, and pulled his son into the curve of his arm. He did not look at Victoria. Not yet. Ethan's voice came muffled against his father's shoulder, so quiet that only Daniel could hear it. "Dad, are we trash?" Something moved across Daniel's face that was not anger. It was older than anger. He pressed a kiss to the top of his son's head and held him for a long moment before he spoke. And when he did, his voice was quiet, but it carried the way a voice carries when it has been trained to be heard inside a helmet, inside a cockpit, inside a storm. "Look at me, buddy." Ethan looked up. "A man's worth," Daniel said, "isn't in his clothes. It isn't in his bank account. It isn't in the seat he sits in or the watch on his wrist. A man's worth is in how he treats people who can't fight back. That's the whole thing." He was not looking at Victoria when he said it. He did not need to. His voice filled the cabin the way smoke fills a room, slowly, completely leaving no corner untouched. Some folks spend their whole lives buying things to prove they're somebody. And the saddest part is the harder they try, the more they show everyone what they're not. Victoria's hand froze halfway to her champagne glass. She had heard a voice like that before. Not the words, the cadence, the unshakable evenness of it. It belonged to the kind of men her brother used to write home about, men who could land a damaged aircraft in a crosswind and then sit down to dinner like nothing had happened. It was the voice of command, stripped of its uniform. She did not turn around. She could not. Her jaw set hard, and she stared out the window at a sky that suddenly felt very far away. Across the aisle, the elderly man in the cardigan closed his book and rested it on his knee. He looked at Daniel for a long, considering moment. Then very softly, he began to clap. Just twice. Another passenger 1 row ahead joined him. Then a woman in the back of the cabin. And in seat 4A, a mechanic in grease-stained coveralls held his son and did not feel the need to say another word. The applause faded into the steady hum of the engines, and for a long while, no one in business class spoke. Victoria did not turn around. She kept her face angled toward the window, but her champagne glass sat untouched on her tray, and her thumb had begun to worry the edge of her phone case in small, restless circles. Ethan had stopped crying. He sat curled against his father's side with the broken F-22 cradled in his palms, fitting the snapped wing back against the fuselage and pulling it away again, as if hoping each time that the plastic might somehow have decided to mend itself. "We can glue it when we get to Norfolk," Daniel said quietly. "Good as new. It won't be the same." "No, but sometimes the things that get fixed end up stronger than they were before." The boy considered this with the gravity only a 7-year-old can muster. He nodded once slowly and tucked the 2 pieces into the pocket of his hooded sweatshirt. "Dad." "Yeah. You used to fly planes." "I did. Real ones, like the F-22. Daniel's eyes stayed on the seat back in front of him. "Like the F-22. Why did you stop?" The question was not new. Ethan had asked it before, in pieces on the long drives home from work and the quiet stretch after bedtime stories. Daniel had given him pieces back, a version where Daddy used to fly, and then Mommy got sick, and then there were more important things to do than fly. It had been the version a 4-year-old could carry, a 5-year-old, even a 6-year-old. 7 was different. Daniel let his head rest back against the leather, and for a moment, he was not on flight 2847 at all. He was in a hospital room on the 3rd floor of Northwestern Memorial, where the light came through the blinds in long bars across a thin white blanket. And the woman he had married at 22 was wasting away in a bed that seemed to grow larger around her every week. Her name had been Claire. She had been a 3rd-grade teacher with a laugh that turned heads in restaurants and a stubborn streak that had outlasted 4 rounds of chemotherapy. By the end, she could not lift her head from the pillow, but her grip on his hand had still been strong enough to surprise him. "Daniel," she had whispered. "Look at me." He had looked. "Don't let our boy grow up without a father. You've flown enough. You've done enough. The Air Force has had more than its share of you. Claire, promise me." He had pressed her hand to his lips and held it there until his shoulders had stopped shaking. Then he had nodded, and she had closed her eyes, and a week later he had been standing in front of his commanding officer with a sealed envelope in his hand. The officer had read it without sitting down. He had been a lean man with silver at his temples and the quiet authority of someone who had buried friends. When he had finished reading, he had set the letter on his desk, and then he had stood up, squared his shoulders, and saluted. Daniel had returned the salute. He had not trusted himself to speak. He had walked out of that office and down the corridor and through the gate of the base, and he had not put on a flight suit again. That had been 4 years ago. "Dad." Ethan's voice tugged him back. The cabin lights, the hum of the engines, the soft amber glow of business class returned around him. "I stopped flying because your mom needed me," Daniel said. "And then you needed me, and there was no airplane in the world worth more than that." Ethan watched him for a long moment, the way children sometimes do when they understand more than the adults around them give them credit for. "Was it hard?" "Not as hard as you'd think." "Did you miss it?" Daniel thought about this carefully because his son deserved an honest answer. "Some days. Most days, no. Flying is just a thing you do, buddy. Being your dad is who I am." 2 seats ahead, Victoria's shoulders had gone very still. She had not meant to listen. She had told herself she was not listening. But the cabin was small, and the words had carried, and there was something in the man's voice when he spoke about his wife that landed somewhere she had been trying for 2 years not to feel. Her brother had been 26 years old. James had been the kind of younger brother who never grew out of looking up to her, who had called her on her birthday every single year from wherever in the world the Air Force had sent him. He had written letters home in an age when no one wrote letters anymore. He had told her once in one of those letters that there were 2 kinds of pilots in this world: the ones who flew because they wanted the sky, and the ones who flew because somebody else needed them to. He had written that he hoped by the end to be the second kind. She had buried him on a Tuesday in May. She had not slept through the night since. The phone in her lap buzzed. She glanced down. Another message from her attorney. Another reminder that tomorrow at 9 in the morning, she was supposed to walk into a conference room at the base and demand the name of the senior officer her family believed had failed her brother. She set the phone face down again. Behind her, the man in the coveralls was murmuring something to his son. She could not make out the words. She only knew that the cadence of his voice was unbearable, and she did not understand why. She turned. Not all the way, just enough to speak over her shoulder. "It's quite a story you're telling him." Daniel's eyes lifted to meet hers in the gap between the seats. "It's not a story, ma'am." "No." She gave a small, brittle smile. "A grease-stained mechanic who used to fly fighter jets. Most fathers tell their sons they used to play football. I'm sure they do. And you expect that child to believe it. I don't expect anything from him except that he be honest. The rest is up to him." She wanted very badly to say something cutting. The words assembled themselves on her tongue, and then refused to leave it. Something in the man's face, calm, unbothered faintly. Sad made her own armor feel thin. She turned forward again and did not look back. The man in the gray cardigan across the aisle lifted his book once more, but his eyes had not moved from the same page in 20 minutes. The shutter came at 36,000 feet somewhere over the Appalachians. It was small. So small that most of the passengers did not register it as anything at all. A flight attendant in the galley reached out a hand to steady a cart and then went back to pouring coffee. A businessman in row 6 glanced up, decided it was nothing, and returned to his laptop. Daniel Carter felt it in his spine. He sat up straighter. His eyes went to the wing, then to the small reading light above his head, where the brightness flickered once almost imperceptibly before steadying. His head tilted, as if he were listening to something far away. Ethan, half asleep against his shoulder, mumbled, "Dad, stay there, buddy. Just rest." Daniel watched the wing for another 60 seconds. The aileron on the right side was sluggish on its return travel. Not by much. Not by anything most pilots would notice. But the asymmetry was there, a beat too slow, like a heart skipping the same syllable twice in a row. He unclipped his seatbelt and stood. The flight attendant nearest him looked up with the trained smile of someone about to redirect a passenger to the lavatory. "Sir, will be turning the seatbelt sign on shortly. If you could just, I need you to get a message to the captain." The smile faltered. Something in his voice did not match his clothes. "Sir, tell him to check hydraulic system number 2. Pressure's bleeding off. He'll see it on the secondary indicator before it shows up on the primary. Tell him now, please." The attendant looked at him for a long second. She had been flying for 9 years. She had been trained to recognize panicked passengers, drunk passengers who fancied themselves experts. The man in front of her was none of those things. He was simply telling her something the way a person tells you the building is on fire, with the calm of someone who has been in burning buildings before. She picked up the interphone. What was said between her and the captain Daniel did not hear, but 2 minutes later, the door to the flight deck opened a crack, and a man in 4 stripes leaned out and looked directly at him. The captain's eyes moved over the coveralls, over the grease beneath the fingernails, and then settled on Daniel's face. Whatever he saw, there must have been enough, because he nodded once sharply, and the door closed again. The seatbelt sign chimed on. A minute later, the cabin's PA crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've detected a minor mechanical issue, and as a precaution, we'll be making an unscheduled landing at Langley Air Force Base, which is the nearest suitable runway. There is no cause for alarm. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are fastened." The cabin tensed. A woman 3 rows back let out a small, frightened sound. The businessman with the laptop closed it slowly. Victoria's knuckles went white around the armrest, and the champagne in her glass trembled. Daniel was already moving down the aisle. He stopped at Victoria's row first. She did not look at him. He did not require her to. "Ma'am, take your earrings off and put them in your bag. The diamond ones. Loose items become projectiles in a hard landing. Tighten your seatbelt low across your hips, not your waist. Brace position is forehead against the seat in front of you. Hands behind your head, fingers interlocked but not gripping. You hear me?" She was staring at him now. Her mouth had opened, but nothing came out. "Ma'am, you hear me?" She nodded just once. "Good." He moved on. He spoke to the elderly couple in row 5, to the woman with the small, frightened sound in row 7, to a teenage girl traveling alone in row 9. He did not raise his voice. He did not rush. He simply walked through the cabin, telling people exactly what to do, the way a man does when he has watched ejections and emergency landings, and known both how easily they can kill someone and how often they don't. By the time he returned to his seat, the cabin had quieted. Not because the fear was gone, because it had been given something to do. He buckled himself in beside Ethan and pulled the boy close. Ethan was wide awake now, the F-22 pieces clutched in his fist. "Are we going to crash? No, buddy." "Are you sure?" Daniel looked at his son, and his voice was steady the way bedrock is steady. "I'm sure. The plane is going to land. The pilots up front know what they're doing. We're going to taxi off the runway, and we're going to wait in a building, and then somebody is going to find us another flight. That's the whole thing." "Okay. Brace position when I tell you." "Okay, Dad." The descent began. The aircraft banked north and east, losing altitude faster than a normal landing approach. Through the window, the Virginia coastline appeared, and then the gray cross-hatching of a military runway much wider than the commercial strips Ethan had seen in pictures. The captain came on again, his voice still calm, more clipped now. "Brace, brace, brace." Daniel pulled Ethan's head down against his thigh, one arm wrapped over the boy's shoulders, his own forehead pressed to the seat back in front of him. 2 seats ahead, Victoria assumed the position he had shown her, and as her forehead touched the leather, she found that her eyes had filled with tears for the first time in 2 years, and she did not know why. The wheels touched the runway, hard bounced once and settled. Reverse thrust roared. The aircraft shuddered to a stop, with a great deal more runway to spare than anyone had expected to need. For a long moment the cabin was silent. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single voice said, "Thank God." And then somebody else laughed the strange laughter of people who have just remembered they are alive. Daniel sat up slowly. He brushed Ethan's hair back from his forehead and checked his face for tears that were not there. "Told you, buddy. I wasn't scared. I know you weren't." Across the aisle, the man in the gray cardigan was looking at him again. This time, he did not look away. He gave Daniel the smallest of nods, and Daniel returned it without quite knowing why. The hangar was the size of a city block. The passengers had been deplaned onto a stretch of taxiway and walked under the supervision of 3 young airmen in uniform into a side bay where rows of folding chairs had been hastily arranged. Coffee was being brought out on long carts. A flight crew from Langley Operations was already taking down names. The mood was the strange post-emergency mood of people who had not quite finished being frightened. Half giddy, half exhausted, all of them talking too much, or not at all. Daniel kept Ethan close to his side. He had told the boy not to wander, but Ethan's eyes were elsewhere, fixed on the far end of the hangar, where beyond the temporary partition, the soft gray flank of an F-22 Raptor rose above the maintenance scaffolding like the spine of some sleeping animal. "Dad, I see it, buddy. It's the same." "It is." Ethan's small hand tightened in his. "Can we go closer?" Daniel did not answer at first. He was looking at the aircraft, and something in his face had gone very still. The Raptor's canopy was raised. A technician in a flightline vest was leaning into the cockpit headset around his neck. 2 more were standing near the left intake arguing. It was the arguing that did it. Daniel did not mean to listen. He could not help it. The words drifted across the hangar floor on the way mechanic. Talk always drifts, sharp consonants, half-finished sentences, the shorthand of people who have been chewing on the same problem for too long. "I'm telling you, it's the software. We flashed the module twice last week. And I'm telling you the BIT is clean. You're chasing a ghost." Then explain the spikes during high AOA maneuvers. "I can't. That's the point." Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. He looked down at Ethan, then back at the 3 men by the aircraft. He took 2 steps closer, just 2 enough that his voice would carry, and spoke without raising it. "It's not the software." The 3 technicians turned. The one with the headset around his neck was younger than the others, late 20s, with a lieutenant's bar on his collar and the lean alertness of someone who had been pulling night shifts. He looked at Daniel's coveralls. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Daniel's face. "Excuse me. It's the angle of attack wiring harness in the number 3 sensor cluster port engine bay. Check the insulation where it routes past the heat shield. 800 flight hours is about when it starts to chafe. Your spikes are intermittent shorts, not software faults. You can confirm it by pulling the access panel and looking. If the sheath is silver instead of black, where it crosses the bracket, that's your problem." For a moment, no one said anything. The 2 older technicians glanced at each other. The younger one, Lieutenant Marcus Reed, took a step forward. "Sir, who are you?" "Just a passenger," Daniel said. "That's not what I asked." Ethan, holding his father's hand, looked up at the lieutenant with the open earnestness of a child who did not understand why anyone would not already know. "My dad flew the F-22. He flew it a long time." Marcus Reed's eyes shifted to Ethan, then back to Daniel. Something in his posture had changed. He was very still now, the way a hunting dog goes still when it has caught a scent. "Sir," he said more carefully this time. "What was your call sign?" Daniel looked at him for a long moment. He had not said the name out loud, not to anyone who could understand it, in nearly 4 years. It had lived in the back of his throat for so long that he was no longer sure it would still come when he asked it to. But the lieutenant was waiting, and his son was watching, and there were things in a man's life he could not deny without denying himself. Hawk 1. Marcus Reed's face did not move, but the color drained out of it slowly from the cheekbones downward, like water draining from a glass. The 2 older technicians had heard him. The one to the lieutenant's left dropped the torque wrench he was holding. The metallic clatter echoed off the hangar walls. "Sergeant," Marcus said, his voice gone tight. "Find the colonel. Now." The older technician did not ask questions. He turned and ran. Marcus Reed remained where he was, his eyes on Daniel, as if afraid that looking away might cause him to vanish. His mouth opened, once closed, opened again. "My uncle," he said, finally, and his voice was no longer steady. "My uncle flew off your wing, in the Strait, 2018. He told me about you when I was 13 years old. He said if I ever made it into a Raptor cockpit, I should remember the name." Daniel did not answer. He did not trust himself to. A door at the far end of the hangar banged open. The sergeant was back, and behind him came a man in a flight suit, gray-haired at the temples, the eagle of a full colonel on his shoulders. He walked the length of the hangar, without breaking stride, his eyes fixed on Daniel from 100 feet away. And as he came closer, Daniel saw the colonel's face begin to crumple, in a way that 50-year-old officers' faces are not supposed to crumple. "My God," the colonel said when he was close enough to speak. "My God. Daniel." "Robert." Colonel Robert Hayes stopped 3 feet from him, and for a moment neither man moved. Hayes had been a major when Daniel had walked out of the squadron office 4 years ago. He had been the one Daniel had given the resignation letter to. He had been the one who had stood up and saluted before Daniel had even said a word. "They told me you'd gone to ground," Hayes said. "I tried to find you, twice. Your old phone was disconnected. The address in your file was a vacant lot. I moved Claire's mother into the old house. I rented something small, didn't update the paperwork. For 4 years. For 4 years. Hayes looked at him, at the coveralls, at the grease under the nails, at the small boy holding his hand. And then he looked over Daniel's shoulder, at the hangar full of his airmen, of his lieutenants, of his ground crew, and his pilots, all of whom had stopped what they were doing, because word had spread, the way word spreads on a military base in seconds, with the speed of something that has been waiting a long time to be told. Hayes straightened. His shoulders came back, his chin lifted. Squadron. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. Every airman in the hangar turned at the same time. Squadron attention. Boots struck concrete in a single sound. Backs straightened in a single motion. From every corner of the bay, men and women in flight suits and coveralls and dress blues snapped to. The technicians at the F-22, the mechanics rolling tool carts, 2 pilots who had just walked in from the flight line and stopped dead in the doorway. Lieutenant Marcus Reed standing 6 feet from Daniel. Present. Hayes said, arms. Every right hand in the hangar came up at the same time. The salute held. From the partitioned holding area, where the passengers of Flight 2847 had been told to wait for further information, every head had turned. Through the gap between the temporary dividers, they could see it. The hangar, the aircraft, the rows of uniformed men and women standing rigid, hands raised in perfect salute, and at the center of it, a mechanic in grease-stained coveralls holding the small hand of a 7-year-old boy. Ethan's eyes had gone very wide. He tilted his face up to his father. "Dad," he whispered, "they're saluting you." Daniel did not speak. He let go of his son's hand very slowly. He brought his own right hand up and the motion of it had not been worn away by 4 years of turning wrenches in a Chicago garage. The angle of the wrist was exact. The elbow was square. The fingers were straight. The salute he returned was the salute of a man who had once led other men into a sky no one had come back from cleanly, and who had carried in his bones the way that hand was supposed to move. Hayes brought his arm down. The squadron followed. The colonel stepped forward and without ceremony pulled Daniel into a hard embrace. He held him for a long second, and when he pulled back, his eyes were wet. "Hawk 1, he said. 4 years. 4 damn years and not a word. I had things that needed doing, Robert. I know you did. God help me, I know you did." In the holding area behind them, Victoria Ashford had risen from her folding chair. The coffee cup in her hand had gone cold a long time ago. She had heard the colonel say the name. She had heard it the way one hears a name that has lived in a letter for 2 years. Her brother had written about Hawk 1. Her brother had written about the senior pilot who had gotten his element home through ground fire in the Strait, who had taken the lead bird through a window of less than 90 seconds, who had brought 4 aircraft back when only 2 should have made it. He had written that he hoped by the end to fly like that. She had read that letter at the funeral. She had read it standing over a casket with a folded flag on top, and tonight on Flight 2847, she had called the man who wrote it into being trash. She had broken his son's toy. She had asked with all the certainty of money whether a man like that belonged in business class. Her coffee cup slipped from her fingers and shattered on the concrete floor. Nobody turned. Nobody had to. The sound was very small inside a hangar that had just gone for one long moment as still as a chapel. Victoria pressed both hands to her mouth, and at last, for the first time since they had lowered her brother into the ground, she began to weep. The officers' lounge attached to the squadron building was a low-paneled room with a coffee maker that had seen better years and a wall of framed photographs of pilots who no longer flew. Colonel Hayes led them there himself, his hand resting briefly on Daniel's shoulder as they walked the way a man touches something he had given up expecting to see again. Ethan held his father's hand. In his other fist, he carried the 2 halves of the F-22, and his eyes kept drifting to the photographs on the wall as they passed, searching for a face he had only ever seen in old pictures his mother had kept in a shoebox under the bed. Hayes opened a side door and gestured them in. There were a handful of armchairs, a long couch, a low table. He stopped in the doorway and looked back over his shoulder. "Ma'am." Victoria stood just outside the threshold, her arms wrapped around herself. Eyes red, the broken coffee cup, long since cleared from the hangar floor, and the residue of it cleared from her hands, but not from her face. She had followed at a distance. She had not been invited. She had not dared ask. "Colonel, I shouldn't—" "Come in, Miss Ashford, please." She started faintly at her name. Hayes gave her a look that was not unkind, but wasn't gentle either. "I read the file your attorneys sent over last month. I know who you are, and I think you'd better hear this." She came in. They sat. Hayes did not. He stood near the window, one hand resting on the back of an armchair, and for a long moment, he simply looked at Daniel as if cataloging the years. "Your boy ought to know," he said finally. "If you'll let me." Daniel glanced down at Ethan, who was watching the colonel with the wide, fascinated solemnity of a child, who has just understood that the grown-ups are about to speak the way they speak when something important is being said. "Go ahead, Robert." Hayes turned slightly to address Ethan directly, and his voice dropped into the register menus when they are speaking to a child about things adult enough to bruise. "Your dad," he said, "was one of the 5 best pilots I ever flew with, and I have flown with a lot of pilots." Ethan's eyes went wider. 9 years ago, your dad and 3 other men were sent on a mission in a part of the world I'm not going to name for you, because the name doesn't matter. What matters is that something went wrong on the ground, and 4 American airplanes got caught in a place they shouldn't have been with weapons pointed up at them from places we hadn't known about. The flight lead, the man in charge, that was your dad. They called him Hawk 1. The youngest pilot in that group of 4 was a lieutenant named James Ashford, and the second youngest was a captain whose nephew is standing out in the hangar right now, wearing a lieutenant's bar. Victoria made a small sound somewhere between a breath and the start of a word that did not come. Hayes did not look at her. He kept his eyes on Ethan. Your dad got all 4 of those airplanes home. He flew last. He stayed back so the younger pilots could go through the corridor first. He took fire that the others didn't take, because that's how he flew. The Air Force gave him medals for it. A lot of medals. But the only thing your dad ever said about that day to me or to anyone was that he was glad the kids made it home. Ethan looked up at his father. His mouth was open slightly. He did not seem to be breathing. And then a year later, Hayes went on more quietly. Your mom got sick, and your dad came into my office and put a letter on my desk, and he walked away from the cockpit and the airplane and the medals and all of it, because being your father and being your mother's husband was more than any sky he was ever going to fly through. Ethan's lower lip trembled. He turned his face into his father's side and held on with both small hands, the broken F-22 pressed against Daniel's chest. Dad, I'm here, buddy. You stopped flying because of Mom, and because of me. I didn't stop, Ethan. I chose. There's a difference. Was it hard? Daniel kissed the top of his son's head. It was the easiest decision I ever made in my life. Across the room, Victoria had gone very still. The hands in her lap had begun to shake. When she spoke, her voice was not the voice she had used on Flight 2847. It was barely a voice at all. James. Daniel lifted his head. You knew James, my brother. James Ashford. I knew him. He was the lieutenant. He was the lieutenant. You brought him home. I brought him home, ma'am. He brought himself home, too. He flew well that day. He flew very well. Her face broke. There was no other word for it. 2 years of held composure, 2 years of attorneys and inquiries and rage that had no proper place to go collapsed at once, and Victoria Ashford put her face in her hands and wept the way people weep when they have finally stopped pretending they are not going to. No one moved to comfort her. There was nothing to be comforted with yet. She had not yet earned the right to it, and she knew somewhere under the weeping that she had not. When she could speak again, she did not lift her face. She spoke into her own palms. I spent 2 years, she said, blaming someone for my brother's death. I had to. If I didn't blame somebody, I was going to come apart. So I built a person in my head who must have been responsible. Some senior pilot who signed off on the wrong flight. Some officer who didn't care. And every time I saw a man in a uniform, every time I saw anyone who looked like he might have known James, I hated him a little for being alive. Her shoulders shook, and tonight I got on an airplane, and I saw a man in coveralls with grease under his fingernails, and I made him stand in for every uniform I'd ever wanted to break. I broke his son's toy. I called him trash. I asked the flight attendant to prove he was allowed to sit where he was sitting. I did all of that, and I told myself I was tired, and I told myself I was grieving, and I told myself it gave me the right. She lifted her face at last. It was wet and red and stripped of everything she had walked onto the plane with. And it turns out the man I called trash is the man my brother wrote home about. The man my brother wanted to be. The man who got him through a corridor he should not have come out of. And I have just spent the last 3 hours of my life trying to humiliate him in front of his son. She got up. The motion was unsteady. She walked the few steps to where Daniel sat, and she did not approach him the way one approaches a stranger, and she did not approach him the way one approaches a hero. She approached him the way one approaches a man one has wronged, which is to say slowly, with both hands open and visible, and a head that has learned how to bow. Mr. Carter, I am asking not for your forgiveness, because I have not earned it, but for the chance to say in front of your son that what I said to you on that airplane was the worst thing I have said to anyone in my life. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Daniel looked up at her for a long moment. There was no triumph in his face. There was something more difficult, which was the look of a man who had been given an apology and was deciding what to do with it. He stood. He was taller than she was. The coveralls were still stained. His hands were still rough. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was quiet, but very clear. "I want you to listen to me carefully, because I'm only going to say this once, and I'm going to say it in front of my boy, because he needs to hear it too." She nodded. "You're not apologizing to me because of what you said. You're apologizing to me because of who I turned out to be. If I'd been the mechanic you thought I was when you got on that plane, you would not be standing here right now. You'd be on your way to Norfolk, and you'd never have given that flight a second thought." Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. "That's the part I want you to take with you, ma'am. Not what you said to me. What you would not have said to me if I had been who you thought I was. Because that mechanic exists. There are 100,000 of him in this country, and they get up every morning, and they raise their kids, and they pay their taxes, and they bury their wives, and they deserved everything I deserved from you tonight, before anybody in this hangar ever stood up." Victoria's eyes spilled over again. She nodded once, twice, a third time. She did not try to speak. Ethan, who had been watching her with the strange clarity of a child, taking the measure of a grown-up, slid down from his place beside his father. He walked the 3 steps to where Victoria stood. He held up the 2 halves of his airplane. "You can keep this one," he said. "I have another at home." He did not, in fact, have another at home. Daniel knew it. Victoria did not. She looked down at the broken plastic in his small hands, at the snapped wing at the canopy clouded with 3 years of fingerprints, and she sank to her knees on the carpet of the officer's lounge in a coat that cost more than the mechanic's son made in a month, and she took the broken toy from him as if it were made of glass. "I will keep it," she whispered, "for the rest of my life." Ethan considered this with great seriousness, then nodded, satisfied, and went back to his father. Hayes cleared his throat. His own eyes were not entirely dry. "There's something I'd like to show the boy," he said, "if his father will allow it." They walked together down a long corridor that opened onto a side bay of the hangar, where a single aircraft sat under the white lights, polished and silent, with the tail number 04 painted in dark gray along its vertical stabilizer. Hayes stopped 20 feet short of it and let Daniel and Ethan walk the rest of the way alone. Ethan stared up. The Raptor rose above him like a held breath. The swept wings, the angled tail, the dark canopy, the long, cruel beauty of the airframe. He tilted his head back until his neck would tilt no further. "Dad." "Yeah, buddy. You flew this one. I flew this one. You really flew this one. I really did." Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then his small hand found his father's, and he leaned against Daniel's leg and he did not let go. Daniel looked at the airplane. He looked at the boy. He thought about a hospital room on the 3rd floor of Northwestern Memorial, and a 3rd-grade teacher with a laugh that turned heads, and a promise made over a thin white blanket. "I used to think," he said quietly, more to himself than to his son, "that flying this airplane was the greatest thing I would ever do." Ethan looked up at him. "I was wrong, buddy. The greatest thing I ever did was come home to you and your mom." Behind them in the doorway of the bay, Victoria Ashford stood holding the broken halves of a child's toy and understood, perhaps for the first time in her life, what wealth actually was. Outside the hangar, the Virginia evening was settling soft and blue against the runway lights. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the next flight to Norfolk was already in the air. There would be a funeral in the morning. There would be a grandmother to bury. There would be eventually a return to a small apartment in Chicago, and a garage that smelled of motor oil, and a life that to anyone walking past it on the street would look like nothing at all, and that Daniel Carter had learned a long time ago was exactly the point. Never measure a man by the hands he works with. Sometimes the hands that once held the stick of a legend have chosen instead to hold the small hand of a child. And there is no metal on Earth in any sky that weighs more than that.